I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And here we are, as promised, for the first of our 21st century specials. As was explained at the end of the previous podcast, these specials are going to be dealing with things that we've enjoyed exclusively in the 21st century, i.e. not the olden days at all. We'll be coming on to children's programmes in the next episode, but we're starting off here with a special entitled 21st Century Adult, which doesn't mean that we're looking at X-rated programmes from the 21st century, but merely programmes that are aimed at a grown-up audience. The first three of these are comedy shows, all of them named after their main star, for whose comedy the show is providing a vehicle in many ways. Miranda is a sitcom that first aired on BBC Two in 2009, starring Miranda Hart as a fictionalised version of herself. Of course, a lot of the comedy is inspired by things she has experienced and observed in her life, even though that life doesn't bear a lot of physical relation to the life of the sitcom character. It is a sitcom that has provided us with a notable amount of entertainment, enjoyment and amusement in the 21st century.
I find that it makes me feel very positive. It cheers me up if I need cheering up. It's very fun. Miranda breaks the fourth wall a lot, and she's the kind of character who's not really at ease with herself and a bit sort of clumsy and awkward. And Tom Ellis, who plays her love interest, Gary, in some sort of interview or something, once said that it makes people feel better about themselves. It made people cool with not being cool. I think that's an exact quote. And Miranda's always very warm, chummy with the audience, and that's nice. So even if it's not always very funny, which I think it sometimes is and sometimes isn't in terms of the actual jokes and content, it's just always nice to watch. At least the first two series are. Then they wait a little bit too long for the third series, and the comedy becomes a bit forced and not really very good, and it does rather detract from the warm fuzzies that one gets from it. And then they waited far too long to finish it off, which is so silly because they had a very good opportunity to finish it with series 3 after sort of dithering a bit anyway. And they waited years and years and years to finish it off, and it was giving me the feeling that it was a bit of a chore. It was something Miranda had got on the back burner, like, I'll have to do that sometime. And maybe that's not how it felt to her at all, but it's how it came across, a bit of a rushed finish.
Yes, in practical terms, it kind of became a victim of Miranda Hart's widening success elsewhere. She didn't really have time for it, whether she wanted to do so or not. It always strikes me when watching the first series that Miranda and Tom Ellis do have very good chemistry, and I really do believe in them as a pair of long-standing friends who are ready to enter at this stage in their lives a romantic relationship. And of course the big problem there is that has to get spun out and spun out and spun out. He marries someone else, she gets off the train to get together with him, and then they don't do it anyway until the stupid specials many years later. Because that's how these shows work, isn't it? Not finishing properly, becoming unbelievably drawn out to keep the show going, the drama going, the sit going, which is always unfortunate, and it is particularly annoying in Miranda because they already seem too comfortable with each other and ready to be a couple from the very first episode, really. But yes, there's plenty of warmth and laughs along the way, I do find as well.
Yes, as I said, I thoroughly recommend the first two series in particular.
Next we have two comedy sketch shows based around the talents of a particular comedian. In each case, the Catherine Tate Show first aired on BBC Two in 2004. It's quite interesting to read how Catherine Tate was being discovered by the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and so on. And rather like Miranda, after getting onto primetime BBC, she achieved a lot of success and being wanted elsewhere, and her own show kind of suffered, got delayed in the process. But Catherine Tate is a very talented comedy performer and comedy actress, and that's why her comedy characters on her sketch show do elicit a lot of laughs from us and did get watched in repeats over and over and eventually bought on DVD, and we do enjoy watching them sometimes. Obviously, her big in-the-suit characters are, or at least were, Nan and Lauren, because they're both very funny to watch and contain a lot of truth about the kind of people in society that they represent. But there's a lot of other very enjoyable stuff in there, amusing characters, send-up situations, that makes the Catherine Tate Show well worth watching from time to time, I find.
My favourite one is How Many, How Much is the name of the sketch. At some point there was a book of scripts knocking around that I think someone had given as a present. It said the characters' names are Kate and Ellen, and they're in this office always sitting at the same desk in exactly the same position, and Kate is trying to get on with her work and Ellen is making her guess things even though she's crap at it and getting annoyed at her silly guesses. I find that terribly funny.
That's one of those things, isn't it, that has a certain amount of truth in it. Catherine Tate reminds you there of certain ghastly people working but not really working in an office situation. And poor old Mrs. Cakeworthy, as we always call her, because of the green grass, is just trying to get on with her work and being stopped at every turn.
On one of the special features, Catherine Tate's talking about that to probably someone else and saying when we were developing this sketch and these characters, we weren't quite sure which of the two characters I would be playing, the one who does the really bad guesses or the one who gets annoyed by them, because they're both very comedic. I also enjoy Sam and Paul. I think the sketch may be called, when it's written down, Essex Couple. She said they were based on a couple who happened to be from Essex that she knew, who laugh at nothing. Sam, the lady in this couple, does sort of everyday silly things, tells Paul about them, and they find them absolutely hilarious. And it is quite funny in itself, that comedy, the way she tells these stories about accidentally plugging in the cavity air instead of the kettle and that kind of thing. Also, it's very nice and heartwarming, like Miranda. They're obviously very, very happy together and enjoy their lives.
I like the brief inclusion of their kids at the end of one of the Christmas sketches. They have a son and daughter who are very like them and like to laugh at nothing, only waking up half an hour after you've gone to sleep. But that sketch does suffer later on, taking that idea further into friends and family members who are exact clones of the comedy characters, and that's the only bit of comedy that's presented to you in the sketch. I'm thinking of Bernie and her sisters there as another example of that, which is an aspect of the Catherine Tate Show we sometimes say, well, that's not the best thing about it, not the best way to get comedy.
She has the same kind of idea with Nan, her sister played by Sheila Hancock and her daughter played by Kathy Burke. But I do think both of them bring their own kind of spin on it. Kathy Burke in particular is very funny, saying the same sorts of things Nan would say, but in her own voice with her own inflections. And she, of course, is the mum of Jamie, the character who appears in every Nan sketch, the person whose Nan she is, played by Matthew Horn. Very well indeed. You absolutely believe in him being absolutely mortified by how confrontational and sometimes racist or homophobic Nan is. Matthew Horn also plays Ryan, Lauren's, as he described it in a special feature again, on-again, off-again boyfriend. He's very funny in that role. And of course, he went on to have a lot of his own success off the back of the Catherine Tate Show, and well deserved it was.
I do enjoy Natalie Cassidy doing a kind of Lauren take-off in one of those Lauren sketches. Again, that's comedy that needs the right kind of guest star to make it work. Catherine Tate's own regular backup performers are all very good and add a lot to the show. I particularly like Lise, Lauren's regular female companion, extremely convincing. Nikki Wardley, that's the name, so there we go, a special mention for her too. We mentioned last year on the Muppets podcast the unexpected and very welcome introduction into our lives of Kevin Bishop in Muppet Treasure Island. He took a bit of a break from acting and comedy after that to finish his education, but it was interesting to spot Kevin Bishop turning up again in the early 2000s. We used to watch those ITV pantomimes. There were 4 of them that used to be on at Christmas. Kevin Bishop turned up as Dick Whittington, and we were like, oh yeah, it is him. He did an excellent job there. And he ended up on Channel 4 doing these celebrity impressions of people like Robbie Williams for a show called Star Stories. And off the back of that, he got his own eponymously titled comedy sketch show, The Kevin Bishop Show, which we watched with great eagerness during the summer of 2008 and the summer of 2009. It had the 2 seasons there and didn't come back for a 3rd season, which was probably a good idea. The 2nd season isn't as good as first, but it was certainly worth doing. That's something that's been said about the Thin Blue Line before, and it's equally true in this case. There's some very funny stuff in there, and it does showcase Kevin Bishop's excellent acting skills, singing skills, comedy skills, and, as got him the show in the first place, as I mentioned, mimicry skills, impersonating and taking off these celebrities, which is an aspect that's used extensively in the show to varying degrees of success and is often very funny.
I seem to remember the Radio Times or something had an article or a little bit of writing about it saying, unlike other shows that claim to push boundaries, this one actually does. It has got some stuff that you might not feel very comfortable laughing at. For instance, it gets a lot of jokes out of Hitler and the Nazis. Some people might find the show quite offensive. Some things I don't find funny and some things I do find funny. It's got a real mix of one-offs and impressions, as you said, and characters like Catherine Tate has characters. Of course, she had the odd one that would only be in the one episode. Sometimes we say, well, it's dropping off a bit in the 2nd series. I think that is the case where characters from Series 1 make a reappearance. They're not really working anymore, but the new characters for Series 2 I do find funny. I'm thinking particularly of 2 sketches. One is Michael Rockefeller, who's a personal shopper working in Bloomingdale's, who was inspired by a real person Kevin Bishop encountered in such a place, claiming to love London and talking a lot of misconceptions about why Princess Diana shot herself, and there we go, that's a bit near the knuckle, isn't it? All that kind of thing. I also very much enjoy from Series 2 the Trustafarians, Tom and John, who are these posh young adults who go around complaining. For example, one of them has to buy ski gear out of the $2,000 that he's got given as a present instead of getting it as a separate present and saying these things are just a bit annoying. And I believe I've heard that that was inspired by a conversation he heard on a train between 2 such young adults.
Kevin Bishop, like Catherine Tate, has some good comedy talent backing him up on the show. The Kevin Bishop Show launched the career of Karen Gillan to great heights. She does a wonderful job on there, and so do his other backup performers. I particularly like Jim Howick, with his amusing archetypal voices and his great talent for coming across as kind of an everyday bloke reacting quite nonchalantly to weird things happening in the sketch.
Oliver Maltman really is an impressionist, I think. Between them, he and Jim Howick cater for every requirement. Oliver can do a very accurate impression of Bob Geldof, for instance, and I love his Christopher Walken when he's doing Walken's Crisps, even though I don't think I've ever actually seen the real Christopher Walken. I love Karen Gillan's impression of Cheryl Cole, your toilet cleaning bitch, etc.
The other 2 adult shows we have here to talk about are dramas rather than comedies, though of course we do enjoy any successful comedic elements they have about them, because it's a good idea always to have an eye on comedy while making drama, so that it is more realistic and relatable. True Calling was really what Eliza Dushku did directly after Buffy, and it's something we used to watch on Sky One. They used to pair it with Angel after Buffy was finished, and it's kind of a vehicle for Eliza Dushku, and she does do a very good, very striking job leading the show. I believe Eliza Dushku and her mother pointed out certain problems with the show at some point, rather like Charlie's Angels in the 70s. It's supposed to be showcasing strong female lead characters, or a character in this case, and in many cases it ends up treating them kind of badly, being kind of sexist, treating them as stupid, not as good as the men. True can't do anything without a man to get her out of the trouble she'd got herself into. The whole setup of the show does rely on True consistently being rather stupid and failing to piece together the mystery of the death she's trying to get to grips with and prevent, when really the solution should be blatantly obvious to her. It's a bit like Mumra constantly using immortality as an excuse for extreme sloppiness. For the situation to work in the show, the character has to come across as extremely inadequate and rather bad at what they're supposed to be doing.
Yes, the death, reliving the day, finding out about it, preventing it, has to fill the time slot, so True really does need to forget things that the audience will likely have made a mental note of straight away, if they're canny, certainly. At one point, she even forgets there's a little girl, no more than 6, hiding under the bed in a fire. Oh, good, we got the little boy out, and the fireman's okay, too. And we're like, there was a little girl, True, have you forgotten her? That's the kind of thing all such shows will come across, and some will handle it better than others. Down the line, True Calling actually did find a solution to that. Perhaps stumbled across it, I'm not sure. But there is still some of that sexism that you were talking about with Luke fixing the sink. She has to get a man round to fix the sink. Any man, not a plumber or anything. But also the rest of the female cast, they really struggle to do anything with. I don't know how good the actors are who played Lindsay, True's best friend, and Meredith, True's older sister, who's a lawyer with the drug addiction. They're not able to make as much of what they're given to do as the men, and that is probably largely or entirely because of the material, and they're both written out at or before the end of season 1. And during this cast shake-up, another man comes along, and this is that solution to, well, how can this really obvious thing be spun out for 40 minutes? The anti-True Jack, played by Jason Priestley, very well indeed, very convincingly, very humorously where appropriate, very emotionally where appropriate. And with him coming along and trying to stop her from saving these lives, she can spot what to do quite early on, as soon as the rest of us do, and then have these other obstacles to overcome other than her own stupidity.
That's where the show really very strongly started reminding us of Quantum Leap, I think, with the evil day reliver rather than the evil leaper. Of course, Jack would argue he's not evil, he's just trying to restore the balance of fate that True is interfering with. But then who gives the dead people the chance to ask for a second chance at life? Isn't that fate? Some interesting questions about the mythos of the show that never get fully explored or answered, but it is an interesting idea. Those two particular mainstay male actors who are in every episode of True Calling with True and do such an excellent job of making the most of what they're given are Sean Reeves as True's brother Harrison and Zach Galifianakis as Davis, True's boss. And I believe I've mentioned Davis specifically on the podcast before as a successful comedy geek character. That's one aspect of his character, sort of geekishness, liking Dungeons and Dragons. So on. He's also a doctor who can't stand to work on living people, so he's become a mortician. Zach does an excellent job bringing them to life, making him feel real and warm and making us wonder just how much he knows about what's going on in True's life and developing him into an excellent support network for True in her work along with Harrison. Quite quickly, the powers that be making the show realise Harrison must be in on this and helping True, and that's never considered for either of those female characters you mentioned.
I love Harrison particularly. Sean Reeves is very talented, very funny, and those talents are enhanced by his cuteness. A very good use of him is to have him kind of vamp and make up excuses and things for snooping around. For instance, True sent him into this cabin in a place where you can stay in these like log cabin rooms to find stuff out, and the person renting the cabin comes back in, and Harrison has this. I thought this was my cabin. I came in, I was like, where's my stuff? That kind of thing he does extremely well. He's also rather a good action hero. I love the bit where he's got in the car with the guy who's going to crash his car and kill himself, and Harrison leans over him and opens the door and hurls them both out onto the road before the car crashes.
The fact that we are so used to him being amusing in the show does add extra weight to scenes of action that he's involved with, as you mentioned, and of course the more emotional stuff he does. In that one where he's been attempting and managing to convince the college student with awful parents not to kill herself. And he's finally managed to do it, and he's so relieved. And then she kills herself anyway, and he is absolutely devastated and can't work out why that's happened. You've got to feel for Harrison there, of course, actually, as nobody knows yet, except the audience. It was Jack. All he has to do is phone the awful parents, and the poor girl's feeling suicidal again.
They turn up saying, "Oh no, why did she kill herself? Oh, it's only money. It's because you phoned her up and gave her such crap." Jason Priestley as Jack is very good at emotional stuff too, as I mentioned earlier. It's a very memorable, interesting, striking episode where he gets asked for help by a dead person and discovers that the help she needs is to make her death look like an accident rather than a suicide, so her sister can get her life insurance policy, and he gets sort of attached and isn't sure if it's the right thing to do to help her die.
Yes, he really didn't want to end up in the situation where he's holding her hand and she's dangling off the building, and it really is up to him. Is she going to live or die today? He doesn't want to let her go at all. So a horrible situation there for him, and Jason Priestley does make us sympathise with the character. And yeah, his addition to the show is extremely successful.
Of course, True has to be very stupid all over again when someone's died in the dark and she's not sure who's asked for help, so she goes following Jack around like, oh, who is he trying to make die? Well, haven't you been paying attention? Nobody. He's trying to fix it so that the person still dies. And she plays right into his hands of doing the old magician's trick of making her look the wrong way while the electrician gets on with electrocuting himself to death.
That reminds me how another trap that True Calling does fall into is setting up a situation where the character professionally is in the right position for the premise to happen quite naturally, and ends up happening in their everyday lives anyway, which makes it really unbelievable. It's the same as with Poirot. He's a private detective for hire, and yet half the time he'll stumble across a murder on his holiday, or on his plane, or on his train, or in his restaurant, or in his dental surgery. Same with True. She's working at the morgue, collecting the bodies, preparing the bodies. The bodies are supposed to ask her for help, and then the day rewinds. Far too often later on it becomes, in True's everyday life, whoops, there's a dead body asking her for help.
And that reminds me, I find it a bit irritating to avoid the faff of having her get up out of bed every morning. She keeps falling asleep in the car, in class when she's a medical student in season 2, at work, just wherever, so that she can wake up at that point and jump to it.
So it's a show that has brought us enjoyment in many ways over pretty much 2 decades, and has a lot of potential, some of which is realised by the talents of Eliza Dushku, Sean Reeves, Zach Galifianakis, and Jason Priestley in particular. Finally in this podcast we have In the Flesh, which aired on BBC 3 in 2013 and 2014, and the DVD says, amongst other things, it is very clever, cleverly written, cleverly crafted, and that is genuinely true. It is an extremely clever, accurate, thought-provoking piece of satire and social commentary, presented very relatably, very believably, and that's in huge part thanks to the actors making it seem that way. With a zombie outbreak having taken place and medicated zombies being reintegrated into society, that's exactly what it would be like if that happened in real life. things like the NHS posters about partially deceased syndrome and the very good take-off of the Conservative politician. The actor there very much presenting us with what some stumbling idiot like David Cameron or Boris Johnson would be saying in that sort of situation. And of course it's a very effective allegory in the first season for homophobia, really. Homophobia in society, the main character, Kieran, having to come to terms with himself as a zombie in the way that he never felt able to come to terms with himself as a gay 18-year-old in this small northern village of Rawton. And that's not to say he'd have been better off anywhere else in the country, that's just where it happens to be said.
It's a bit like that episode of The Incredible Hulk, which seems to be about parachute jumping guys, but actually it's all about gay guys whose parents don't accept the relationship.
And this was really quite original and groundbreaking and not something you'd see all over the place run into the ground like you do now back in 2013. It was doing it very naturally, very sensitively, in a way that was relevant to the world as it was and had been for some time, but wasn't doing it as an agenda.
Almost all of the characters' attitudes to zombies mirrors their attitude towards homosexuality. The local nurse, Shirley, is fine with homosexuality and she's fine with zombies, and that's why she's trained as the local PDS care in the community kind of person. The human volunteer force, who went around quite understandably shooting zombies before the treatment, neurotriptyline, was discovered. Almost all still have this prejudice against zombies, don't want treated zombies in the community, even kill a recently returned zombie on medication. The exception to all of this that I'm saying is Jem, Kieran's sister, who was fine with him being gay and genuinely just has to come to terms with the fact that her brother, who she loved very much, whose suicide she was devastated by, has returned as a zombie.
Their relationship really is the central one in the show in many ways. Kieran kind of has to learn to come to terms with himself as easily as Jem came to terms with him when he was alive, and she has to come to terms with him dead as he himself does.
They use symbolism very well with the cover-up moose and the contact lenses. Amy, Kieran's BDFF, best dead friend forever, says to him, "You wear too much of that stuff." He says to her, "Well, you don't wear enough," because she is so at ease with who and what she is that she wants to have PDS sufferers accepted as they are in society.
And then, of course, in season 2, that gets carried too far with the militant stuff, the dangerous stuff. But that sort of thing, too, is presented very sympathetically. With Simon, you can see exactly why he's been drawn into the cult. As you were saying when we were watching it recently, that's how people feel accepted in a dangerous cult, when they haven't got the acceptance, the love and support that they should be getting from their own family.
Simon, the Irish rotter, is so successful. He's introduced as someone that Amy has brought back from the brainwashing cult, and he talks to Kieran and he talks to all the other dozens of people who have suddenly died and come back in Broughton. Slightly unbelievable that, but anyway, he talks to them very gently and Irishly and lets them speak and say what's on their mind, and you understand why people are willing to communicate with him and talk to him about their experiences. The penultimate episode of the series, we get his backstory. He's very interestingly the first to respond to neurotriptyline. He agrees that they can do more experiments on him, and he's getting his spine cut open and all kinds of things and getting a bit sick of it. We also see him reunited with his father, who seems that he's going to accept him despite the fact that Simon has eaten his own mother, which is very devastating for him. And then suddenly in the middle of the night he decides he can't face Simon and kicks him out. Simon has nowhere to go, and then he's accepted into this cult where people are very welcoming, and it all makes so much sense.
The satire is kind of widened in that second season, with the PDS sufferers becoming more representative of any kind of outsider in society, like asylum seekers, for example, having to complete the give-back scheme and then be repatriated. Job seeking, perhaps, is also in there, doing all this manual labour that nobody else wants to do for no pay. It's about being on the fringe of society and being looked down on and treated as second-class citizens or barely citizens at all. And of course the homosexual element is still important to that and very much relevant to that. Later on in the series, after Kieran has spoken to Simon and has experienced more prejudice and discrimination than he can really cope with, it's quite powerful when he reclaims his identity as a zombie and stops wearing all the cover-up and so on, the contact lenses, and finally is able to come out and say to his parents, "This is who I am. Either you want me as your son as a gay zombie, or you don't want me at all, because I'm a gay zombie." And despite your protestations at the end of the first season, it doesn't seem you do want a gay zombie for a son. But then Steve and Sue Walker, with some pretty heavy self-realisation from some extreme circumstances, including Nurse Shirley giving Sue some home truths, quite accidentally, but it very much hits home. They both do realise they should have been standing up for Kieran all along.
Of course, they represent that attitude of, well, let's not get up in his face about it, let's just ignore it, let's just pretend it isn't true, though we know it is. And this is symbolised by Sue serving Kieran food when he's home. He says, "I don't eat anymore." She says, "Just pretend for a bit, eh, love?" And he mimes eating this piece of lamb she's put in front of him.
Whereas with Rick, the aggressive attitude of his father has caused him to have bikini-clad women posters in his bedroom and join the army and become a self-hating gay zombie. They're disgusting. They're evil.
The forcing of Rick to be straight or to appear straight in the zombie allegory is that he's taken to the pub and they force beer down his throat, Bill and his mates, and Rick then has to go and throw it all up into the toilet secretly, like he would do metaphorically if he was being forced to be married to a woman or something like that. Very striking when Rick comes to Bill without his lenses in and no makeup on, saying, "If Ren's evil, Dad, then so am I."
As you pointed out, Bill's hatred of Kieran really starts and ends at the fact that Rick loves Kieran, and Bill's not really bothered if Kieran's a zombie or not. He's just that gay lad who's made my son gay. There are some things in the second season, which is twice as long as the first season, that they kind of feel they need to put in for plot and themes that don't always hit home exactly. I think Jem's PTSD isn't very well handled. She kind of seems to have come to terms with things in her own way in the first season.
Again, she's dealing with actual zombie stuff, PTSD from killing zombies in what they call the war.
And at the end of season 2, significant moments for Jem when she admits to Kieran, "I think I need some help here." She's accepted that. She's quite comfortable to be with Kieran and confide in Kieran and lean on him emotionally and hug him physically while he's in his zombie form, as it were. Ironically, it seems that Kieran's about to come back to life at the end of the series, and that seems to be the end result of neurotriptyline, and it was originally designed as a cure. We find out through season 2 that if the zombies take it long enough, they'll start coming back to life. Not sure exactly how they would have handled that in season 3, and we didn't get the chance to find out, unfortunately, because BBC 3 wouldn't invest any of their final year budget. Of course, it's back now, isn't it, BBC 3, but it was winding down in 2015, in a conclusion to In the Flesh, which was a bit of a shame. And yes, it is a very clever, very effective, very well pulled off show. And yes, as I touched on earlier, the cast making it seem so real and relatable is a big part of that. They all do an excellent job. This is how real people would be and would react and interact in these situations. And we must give particular praise to Luke Newbury as Kieran Walker. The way he interacts with and plays off particularly Harriet Kane's as Kieran's sister Jem Walker is a really centrally important aspect of the show, but they all do an excellent job.
Amy is played by Emily Bevan, and I find her a very interesting character. Let's praise Dominic Mitchell for being able to write properly about women, Jem and Amy and Shirley. Sue refers to Amy when she's suggesting Kieran would like to have a friend round as that nice unconventional girl. Hiya, fam, is how she introduces herself to Kieran's family for the first time, coming round without her makeup on, so they look completely horrified, of course. All part of her being very out there and very comfortable with who she is. And that's why I don't understand why, after establishing that Kieran had wanted to be cremated but his parents had buried him, she says that is so sweet of them. It doesn't appear to be sarcastic. So why on earth would she say that? It's not in character for her to think that burial is in any way better than cremation. I don't get that at all.
Quite a powerful bit I take away from quite near the end of the series as a whole, which sums up the whole thing quite nicely, I think, is what Kieran, having come fully to terms with himself and the world and how he fits into it as a gay zombie, says to Gary, who's very much the epitome of all these terrible attitudes used in varying ways throughout the two series rather successfully. I don't think you're stupid, Gary. I think you're stubborn and narrow-minded and unfair. Just like the rest of the world, really. So hopefully after watching In the Flesh, we'll all feel inclined to be somewhat less so. Join us again next time, and we'll be moving on, as I mentioned, to talking about some exclusively 21st century children's television. Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.